Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this Section 2209 webinar. Just a reminder, the notice and comment, or the comment period for the feedback for the FAA is due June 6th is the expiration date, so please make sure you get those in. Hopefully this discussion here with me and the group of experts, I don't know if I would call myself an expert outside of LinkedIn, but there's that. We'll be talking through some of the legislative provisions that are in there and have a good discussion on that. So before we get started, I want to thank Security Industry Associations, or SIA, for hosting this event. So thank you so much, and we'll get rolling. So for me, my name is Brandon Youngblood. I'm a senior consultant with ZBeta. Been in the drone industry for 23 years now, and really looking forward to this webinar. I'll turn it over to Mr. Scott Parker.
Scott Parker. I'm with Aerisq Solutions. I help organizations like critical infrastructure and public safety understand and manage UAS risk. Prior to establishing Aerisq, it's also a private consulting firm. Prior to establishing Aerisq Solutions, I was with CISA as the chief for UAS security.
All right, thank you. And Mrs. Angie Savino.
Thanks, Brandon. I'm Angie Savino, founder of Savino Skies Consulting. Prior to starting my practice, I spent over a decade in national security, including 4 years at DOJ's National Security Division, where I worked at the intersection of counter-UAS law and policy. In that role, I helped draft what later became the Safer Skies Act and worked closely with our interagency partners on the authorities that govern drones and how we respond to them. I started Savino Skies Consulting to help SLTTs and critical infrastructure owners and operators build legally compliant counter-UAS programs that are also operationally effective. Happy to be here today.
Thank you, Angie. And Mr. Nate Ernst.
Thank you, Brandon. Hey, everybody. My name is Nate Ernst. I come from a background of aviation operations for critical infrastructure. I'm the founder and president of a company called the Tactien Group, by which we're a team of advisors that work directly with critical infrastructure operators, so electric, oil and gas, railway, et cetera, on integrating aviation-related technologies into their workflows, primarily on the advanced technology side. Prior to starting the Tactien Group, I come from an operator background, primarily through the Group 1 through 4 UAS space, commercially within the NAS, as well as manned operations, helicopters, and fixed wing. Appreciate you having me here, Brandon. Thank you.
Absolutely. And yeah, Nate, your input is going to be incredibly valuable on this, as you have 3 recovering feds, I guess you would say, and 1 lone outsider, so that'll be good. So before we do get started in the 2209, I just want to briefly kind of go over what's happened in the last year in the UAS space. A tremendous amount of legislative advancements and policy changes over the course of the last year. So first, Safer Skies Act, which is essentially a modification of 6 USC 124N, which gives DHS and DOJ their counter-UAS authority. Part 108 came out, which is the long-awaited Beyond Visual Line of Sight expansion for commercial operations. The notice and comment period ended on that, and we are awaiting the final rule to be issued by the Federal Aviation Administration. Speaking of the FAA, they launched the Deter program, which is a policy change. Prior to the Deter program, it was an educate first, enforce secondary. So the goal of that is really a shift from the FAA saying we've had enough time to where UAS operators should know the regulations, and we are going to start enforcing first as a matter of policy. And so they set up the Deter program, which is their function of being able to do that. There was the roving TFR, or NOTAM, associated NOTAM, which essentially gave DHS roving and mobile units airspace restriction coverage through the 14 CFR 99.7 Special Security Instruction Regulation. There were 2 iterations of that, and 1 is still in place with a lawsuit that is currently being litigated in court. So we are all watching that. I know Angie, especially as a former DOJ prosecutor, is especially interested in where that goes. The TFR for the FIFA World Cup, which is ongoing, went through some changes, and we saw, depending on how you look at it, a delegation of FAA authority to DHS to allow access into those airspace restrictions. The fact that I use the word delegate may cause some issues with a lot of folks out there, but we'll see where that lands. And then obviously the NPRM, or the release of the Section 2209, which came out a decade ago for the 2016 FESA Act, and that requirement. And then it went through two legislative amendment iterations in 2018 and then 2024 in the last FAA Reauthorization Act. And that's where we're going to sit. And so we are going to talk about Section 2209 and some of the provisions in there. And we hope this is useful as you prepare your comments and submit to the FAA for the final rule. So for the first, we're going to start with the enforcement clause in there. So we're going to turn into the enforcement area. So until recently, most UAS airspace violations were treated as a compliance matter, including warning, counseling, and administrative resolution. That changed in January 2026 when the FAA released the new Compliance and Enforcement Bulletin, which is the DETER program, mandating legal enforcement action as the default for any UAS operation that endangers the public, violates airspace restrictions, or furthers a crime. Angie, I'll turn it over to you to talk through the current penalties and how the proposed UAFRs, which is UAS flight restrictions, which is the formal name for now 2209, will fit into this framework.
Thanks, Brandon. So the penalties were on the books long before drones, with one recent exception that I'll address. But the proposed 2209 just adds a new restricted airspace where violating those airspaces bring these penalties into play. So for most flight restrictions, a violation is actually just a civil offense, and the FAA can impose fines of up to $75,000, although the maximum for individuals is much lower. However, a violation of a national defense airspace, that is a criminal offense, but is still only a misdemeanor and carrying only up to a year of jail time. So the one exception I referenced is the Safer Skies Act, as Brandon mentioned, that was passed last December, and it made a second violation of a national defense airspace a felony, carrying up to 5 years of prison, and increased penalties for using drones to commit other felonies. So as proposed, Section 2209 fits directly into the civil and criminal framework, and the exposure depends on which tier is violated. So a standard UAFR would only be enforced through the FAA's existing civil framework, so Part 13 penalties and revoking pilot certificates. It is not designated national defense airspace, so the criminal penalties do not attach. A special UAFR, however, goes further. When it's issued for national security or homeland security purposes, that airspace can be designated as national defense airspace, which is what opens the door to the criminal penalties and the repeat offense felonies we just described. So the proposed 2209 doesn't just create restricted airspace. It creates a tiered enforcement architecture where the most sensitive sites carry those escalating criminal consequences. One question I want to throw to the group is, what do you make of the standard UAFRs carrying only civil penalties? So my own view is that both tiers should carry some criminal exposure, not just the special UAFRs. I think a purely civil penalty invites operators to treat the standard UFRs as optional. And as we've seen with the World Cup, and we're going to probably continue seeing, the civil penalties have had limited success in stopping drone pilots from flying in those airspaces. So I want to kick that off to the group to get your thoughts on the only civil penalties for violations of standard UAFRs.
So I'll kind of start this. I just want to, for baseline understanding, the Section 2209 or the UAFR, whichever one you want to call it, is the standard. It will be the only security airspace type that offers a civil penalty. There are three other forms of security airspace types: prohibited airspace, which is called special use airspace, which is a regulatory type of airspace. It's very limited. There's only about 13 of them inside the United States, and criminal penalties associated with it. 14 CFR 91-141 TFRs are very specific to presidential movements, vice presidential movements, and again, come with criminal penalties. Not only are there criminal penalties, but there's typically a fighter combat air patrol over wherever the president is at any given time within a 91-141. You violate those, there are some very special authorities which, the military and others can take action on in protection of the president, vice president. 14 CFR 99.7 or special security instruction, which has largely been the favored airspace restriction in lieu of Section 2209 being created, as Angie said, also carries some criminal penalties associated with the misdemeanors. So those are the three security airspace types that exist today, and they all have criminal penalties associated with it. So the standard UAFR will be the only security airspace type that does not carry some type of criminal penalty associated with it. So just for distinction and how different this is, and it's such a new precedent, is that it only carry that civil penalty or essentially a fine. So just for baseline understanding of security or airspace security types, that plays into it. Scott or Nate?
Yeah, Scott, I'm going to take a crack at this one first, if that's okay. So, Angie, you mentioned something a few sentences back, and you said that the criminal penalties under current regulations have proven to be ineffective, right? And so my perspective on it is, coming from an operator background that spends a lot of time within the operations of aviation. If the intent is to standardize and integrate UAS, CUAS, and conventional aviation, the rules and penalties across all different types of restricted airspaces should largely be the same. Maybe not the same in types of severity, but criminal.
I guess there has to be someone who's the outlier in every conversation. I think 2209 is purposely bifurcated between special and standard. I think the mere scope and scale of the number of aircraft we can expect to be flying over standard UFR is going to be quite extensive. And I also think that standard UFR, although very important, I'll be the first to stand up and say it's important to have that in place. What we're looking at is people who are violating an airspace that is falling below the threshold of a special, right? So there's a distinction there. And I think it's also important to understand that this violation is a direct response of simply violating airspace. There are many other ways in which people are held accountable if they're truly being malicious, right? So it goes well beyond just the fact that they broke the airspace barrier. If they are truly doing something wrong beyond just flying in the wrong space, there are many other statutes that can be held against them, to be leveraged against them in order to hold them accountable. So in my mind, the FAA did a good thing here. They created this space where there's not an overly criminalization of airspace use, even though we're flying over critical infrastructure. But I think the distinction is worthy of the civil versus criminal and special versus the standard UAS.
And one thing I'd like to throw out there too, and I'd love to turn it back to Angie and kind of wrap us up on this topic, but to Nate's point and to the enforcement penalties associated with the other ones have largely not worked, mostly because they haven't been enforced. Again, it goes back to the policy previous to this, where it was educate first, enforce second. And so there were a lot of people, and Scott and Angie know this very well from being involved in the counter-UAS deployments, working closely with the FBI, Coast Guard, CBP, and a lot of the others, that most of the ground intercept teams or the GIT teams that went out there and made contact with the operators, are you registered? Do you have approval to be here? Do you have your Part 107 license? No. And so it goes back to compliance, and then it goes back to the education first policy, which was U.S. government, USG writ large. They let them go. And so when that happens, you breed a expectation of non-enforcement, and that breeds, I guess, more non-compliance. Sort of like speeding. If you know a cop, when you get pulled over, is going to just let you go because there's an education first aspect, how many times are you going to say, "Oh, sorry, officer, I just didn't know," and you go on your way. So enforcement only works, or penalties only work when those penalties are enforced and applied. And so I just put that out there. And then Angie, as our esteemed lawyer and former prosecutor, what are your thoughts based on the input?
Yeah, I really appreciate, Scott, what you said about how the FAA was thoughtful in having the tiered approach. And I think across all offenses across the United States, criminal and civil, we do see there's benefit, right, to scaling penalties, especially when it comes to drones. One thing that I know that we saw a lot is repeat offenders. So not necessarily repeat offenders in the exact same place, but repeat offenders in different places. So they'd go to one NFL game and then violate, and then they'd go to another NFL game and violate. And that's why it was so important that we included in the Safer Skies Act, or the legislation that we're working on that turned into that, to have that second heightened offense for felonies for up to 5 years if you violate it twice. So I do think that if it stays as its only civil offense, we may start seeing more of these repeat offenders that are violating only standard UAFRs because the violations are not high enough. However, there are monetary penalties, so we'll have to see how that balances out to see if it's actually enough of a deterrent effect to get individuals to stop repeatedly violating the standard UFRs. And then the second one is with the compliance and education. There's many different ways this is go. I'll just throw a plug in. Registration requirements would help with a lot of these issues. I know some of you guys different thoughts on this. But the education piece is huge. And I will say with the World Cup, there has been a huge effort to do a ton of education for drone pilots in many different ways. I would say it's the most forward-leaning, media-heavy education push I've seen from the federal government in the past 5 years. And we are still seeing a lot of individuals be non-compliant. So the education piece, I hope we get to a place where we don't need criminal penalties to stop individuals from flying in standard UAFRs. I'm just not as confident as maybe Scott is that it will actually work and will actually alter individuals' behaviors and keep them out of it.
All right. Definitely looking forward to seeing what everyone else's thoughts are on the comments as they come in. So please again, make sure that you comment on any of these provisions or anything that you see within the registration. And just one plug I should have put into this at the beginning. The FAA is required by law to read every single individual comment and respond back to them. How they do that is up to them, but they are legally obligated to do that. Okay, so enforcement. So we're going to transition a little bit and more go to the applicant side. So the critical infrastructure operator, mass gathering venue, you name it, amusement parks, Disney, Six Flags, all that stuff. So we'll transition to that side. Specifically, the demonstration of need for a UAFR, which is section 74.66, if you're following along in the rule. In that paragraph, subparagraph A, it says, would require applicants to submit information describing the UAS operations in close proximity to the facility during the previous 24 months or 2-year period. Scott, I'll kick it over to you to kick this one off.
Thanks, Brandon. And I think this is where you start to get into the concerning areas that a lot of critical infrastructure are going to have with this rule, if it stays exactly the way it is, without some guardrails. The first is what you talked about. Although the FAA gave themselves some wiggle room by saying that they need to fully understand patterns of life, drone patterns of life around a facility, in order to determine if there is a need, if there's a problem. And they're using this idea that you have 24 months of detection or detected drones. A vast majority of critical infrastructure are not going to have 24 months of detection technology reports. At best, they have a few observable reports, but we know that they have for a long time avoided leaning in the investing to detection technology because there was no real ability to use that information for enforcement. We're getting close to that now, so I think the 24 months of detection technology data is something that won't stand. And hopefully people speak to that. But I think if you do have it, it should be something that it should be allowed and to help make a case, but it should not be a discriminator for those who do not have that 24 months of detection technology. So that's the first piece of demonstration of need. Do you have drones flying around your facility? And if so, what are they? The next part is, so what? And so that's where the FAA is asking an infrastructure owner and operator to describe their vulnerabilities. What gaps do you have in your current protective posture that are exploitable by a drone? And this is kind of where it gets a little bit more sensitive in trying to describe to the FAA your known vulnerabilities which is very, very protected information and guarded information from a private entity, just about anyone's perspective. So having and being able to describe that vulnerability and how drones could possibly exploit that vulnerability is a fine line for, I think, a lot of these owners and operators to walk. And because you want to be able to say, hey, there is a problem set, but you also don't want to show exactly how that problem set exposes your organization. So I think that's definitely an area where owners and operators and anyone who's interested in security should be commenting. The next is the consequence. So what happens if they do exploit that vulnerability? What's the outcome? Is it an issue of public safety or health? Is it an issue of national security? Is it an issue of economic security? Is it an operational disruption? What happens with that disruption or that exploitation of vulnerability? And this is another area where you even have to be very careful, because it's one thing to say I have a vulnerability. It's a whole other thing to also describe what happens to your organization, either economically or otherwise, operationally, when and if that vulnerability is exploited. So it's another area I think the FAA is going to have to be a little bit more empathetic with the owners and operators of critical infrastructure, to say you need to give us something to demonstrate need, but also understanding that they're not going to be able to give you any and everything, because that's very protected. And the last part of the demonstration of need is how you expect the UAFR to affect your overall security posture. So you have the UAFR, now what does that do to your ability to protect that vulnerability? And I think that's going to be hopefully an easier answer for most infrastructure operators, because it clears the air. It helps for threat discrimination, but it's another question that's been asked. So I think the demonstration of need has a lot of changes, especially in how much information, at least clarification to that point, how much information the FAA really is expecting when it comes to vulnerability and the consequence. So I'll stop there to see what my teammates here on this call think about that.
I'll throw out one thing. It's subtle in the rule. It's a requirement without stating it's a requirement, is that you need a drone security program. So everything that Scott just listed, and some within the rule that Scott didn't mention, it essentially states that any organization needs that drone security program in order to provide that data and information. How does it fit into your overall drone or your overall security program, right? So how does it tie into cyber? How does it tie into physical security and perimeter protection? How does it tie into all of these different things? Reporting structure. What is your coordination with local law enforcement in handling these types of things, or your local flight standards district office, the FSDOs? So all of that is really pushing, I would say, vulnerable organizations to drone threats into having an established drone security program, or create one very quickly to be able to address a lot of the requirements in the submission of the application for a UAFR. And that's where I know the group, all four of us here, we've all worked on various organizations' drone security programs to help them develop that, whether it's through drone vulnerability risk assessments, whether it's through helping them with training programs, proof of capability assessments with various counter-UAS technologies, you name it. Nate and I worked on one very closely about a year ago. So just keep that in mind, that the 2209 is really, really pushing down. You need a drone security program. You need to show this. And there's one last thing I wanted to point out, and I know some people may not agree with me on this. I personally do not think the 7466 provision really matters that much as far as what is going on compliance-wise in your area, because if you have a need, a security vulnerability need, especially if it affects the grid, the electric grid, whatever it is, it really shouldn't matter what the normal UAS operations are around your facility. To me, personally, I'm a security-minded person, and that UAFR should be established if you have that need, regardless of what is happening around you. The Walmarts of the world and some of these other organizations that are doing commercial delivery probably differ in that opinion, but that's my personal viewpoint. Nate, Angie?
Angie, you first, please.
So this remind me of just something like an overarching comment for all of these rules, which is, or for everything in this rule, which is so much of this really depends on how the FAA actually applies this, how the FAA actually screens applications, how much time they are able to go through each package and identify risk and assess. I don't think it should be a rubber stamp process where they just approve everything. Obviously, they need to use a critical eye, but if they are very demanding in the amount of information that must be provided, I think that's going to be problematic for exactly what Scott said. Is organizations are going to want to provide the least amount of information possible in order to get what they want, and the less information you have to provide, probably the better, because they're not exposing that to access from other individuals, as we all know. So I do think a lot of it depends on how the FAA applies it. That would be just my overarching comment. And then I am with Scott on this. It's really going to put security managers in a difficult position, as they have to play that balance. How much are we going to expose? Do we want to go through an appeal process if we don't get what the designation we want, and then resubmit with more information? So I think it just can put critical infrastructure owners and operators in a pretty sticky position without providing more guidelines about exactly what needs to be provided and the level of detail. Nate, over to you.
Yeah, so I just want to go back to one of the original things that were discussed, on this topic, and it's this 24-month demonstration of need period, right, as proposed. And again, I go back to the operations side of this. Scott, I totally agree with you. I don't think hardly any facility will have pattern of life data that is quote unquote sufficient over the past 24 months. But at the same time, just because there's not a pattern of life activity in the past 24 months doesn't mean that there's not going to be one in the next 24 months. And so I want to add a third variable to that, right? Because the operators also have privileges too to use aircraft and be able to use them correctly. I don't necessarily think that it should even be a requirement for 24 months. That could be one of the ways, and this is just my 2 cents, this could be one of the ways to demonstrate need. But there may need to be, or should be, alternative ways of demonstrating need, i.e. a drone threat vulnerability risk assessment. Right? And if I don't have activity here today, I probably will tomorrow, and here's why. Right? So maybe that's just an alternative to this whole 24-month data requirement that, quite frankly, I'm not really sure hits the mark for actually demonstrating the need.
Yeah, I agree with what you said, Nate, and also it depends on the what exactly is being protected. We can use nuclear as kind of like the big if something happens. We all know that there's a lot of protections though on the outside of nuclear. Yeah, but if something happens to a nuclear facility, just one, and you have catastrophic consequences, or a huge data center that's running half the hospital is on the East Coast. So just one drone is all it takes. So showing a huge pattern of life may not mean much when it comes to the damage that could be caused by one drone getting through.
Well, you kind of took the words right out of my mouth, Angie. I actually wanted to say this, and this is not a doomsdayer statement by any means, but it's the objective truth. Pattern of life, in most cases, almost all cases, doesn't really matter if it only takes one event to completely cripple an asset.
And I think these are great points. And I've talked to members who are going to advocate for the idea that patterns of life are really a moot point when it comes to certain industries. And when there's an explosive or there's some type of hazardous environment, it doesn't require a pattern of life to make a case that you have a demonstrated need. Flights over people. You don't need to have flights over a crowded stadium to know that they shouldn't fly over a crowded stadium full of people. And so, without authorization. So I think some of that hopefully will get fleshed out in the final.
And to that point too, I mean, a drone doesn't have to attack a facility to be impactful. right? So when to Angie's point on nuclear power, they can, what we used to joke about when we were when I was at the FAA is they can take a 737 to the face and be fine. They're designed to have very robust and strong physical security presence. However, there are operations that are vulnerable to drones, and those are external, and they are a problem. So stadiums, for example, too. If the stadium doesn't have a game or some kind of match going on, is there really a threat? Is there not? Can we loosen up some of those restrictions? And ultimately, that has to be, I think, the venue's decision as to what they deem critical to their site or not. So yeah, we'll see, like what Scott said, and what the final rule comes out with. But a lot of nuances, just as with anything else in drones. So the next two topics are basically dovetails of this topic, and then we're going to end with Nate on the third one for back to the operators and go through that. So the next one, I really hope, I know I'm in the minority on this topic, but the remote ID requirement, which is section 74.56. So there is a requirement for remote identification. You have to have a remote identification receiver established at your facility if you are to get a UAFR. I personally think this is not a good idea. Let me back up. I think it's a good idea to have remote ID receiver at your facility, period, dot, so you know compliant operators, or at least technically compliant operators, when they purchase their drone that has a remote ID module equipped, that you can establish what is flying out there if you're able to receive that remote ID broadcast. However, and this goes back to the policy person in me when I was within the federal government, and on the legislative side that I worked as well, a technology requirement should not be established. And again, there are nuances to this, and with everything in aviation, it depends. A technological requirement baked into a regulation. The reason why I say that is because regulations are incredibly difficult to change. Not as hard as law, but very, very hard. And they're meant to be that way, so that there's not a knee-jerk reaction in regulatory environments. If something were to happen, it still takes time for that regulation to change, to shift to different events in the world that happen, and it's to create economic stability, within our country as far as consistency in regulations. Again, requiring a technology in an emerging space that moves so fast is just not, to me, a good idea. I think it would be a good policy decision, and policy can be changed rather, not, I don't want to say easily, but a lot more easy than what a regulation can change. And so having that requirement in there, again, while a great idea from any practical sense of having some type of sensing technology within your overall security posture is a good thing, I do not, from a policy and legislative perspective, think that having the remote ID requirement baked in a regulation is a good idea. Again, I know I'm the dissenting one, maybe based on what I just said. I've changed people's minds, but I haven't yet. So we'll see what happens. Nate, Angie, Scott, who's the first to bash me? Scott, you want to take a hack at it? I know we've gone to bat on this one.
We have. I'll be the first. I go quick though, because I know Nate has a lot of experience. So in my mind, there's no threat discrimination without remote ID. They are, because of allowed operations, and this, I think that a few things are assumptions. We will have allowed operations to some degree over facilities as part of the UAFR. And so long as you have allowed operations, having remote ID to have any means of threat discrimination, to know who's allowed and who's not allowed, compliance, however you want to frame it, is a necessary component of a UAFR. And I think it also, and I can't speak for FAA obviously, but I think it's also a matter of trying to ensure that owners and operators don't see the extraordinary effort, we'll call it that, of establishing flight restrictions in the airspace as the only solution to a drone problem. they need to have other protocols in place. That's why they require this demonstration of need. That's why they require some type of security operations or a demonstration of security in place in order to, or drone response plan in order to deal with it. It's another way in which it's a all hands on deck approach. They're going to restrict airspace, but owners and operators need to be able to say, I'm also investing in this idea that the airspace is now part of my facility because I'm asking you to restrict it. So I have to be able to maintain some type of awareness on who's flying in and out. The same way they would maintain awareness around a fence line by installing CCTV. Just having a fence doesn't stop someone. Someone may creep over, and you need to have some way of gathering evidence that someone creeped over. And so to me, it's like a part and parcel issue. I think the real argument, Brandon, and where I do support you, is the fact that the FAA and the broader government at large has not created standards for RFID, and there's no way for the owner operators to go get a trusted system that has been federally, has federal guidelines attached to it. And because there's not been a real requirement for this, because it's low compliance, the technology may be lagging a little bit. And so options may be limited, and their success rate may also be limited. It probably will increase over time as people invest in the technology, like all things. But at this juncture, it just seems like the owners and operators are going to have to take it on the chin and invest in things that won't be the best option in hopes of creating a better option. So we're not completely off mark, but I do think remote ID should stay in the final rule. I'll stop.
Go ahead, Angie.
I want to hear yours first after Scott's remarks.
I struggle with this requirement so much, and it's not because I'm for it or against it. It's because I can't figure out where I actually stand on whether or not I support remote ID or not. And what I mean by that is, I spend a lot of time now at this phase of my career vetting and validating technologies. And so a customer could say, I want to do X, and there's 45 different options. Which one do I pick and why? Specifically with remote ID, and it's actually not specific to remote ID, it is largely the entire industry. There are so many options for remote ID technologies to use that all perform wildly different and all execute their intentions the way they say or don't say they're going to perform. And so what I mean by that is, it is unbelievably easy to create your own remote ID sensor from scratch. Is it going to perform as well as one of the other OEMs that actually build them commercially, or another OEM that builds them commercially? Absolutely not. But it's going to conduct remote ID scanning. In my mind, if I'm investing in the technology and I'm forced to buy this piece of technology to comply with 2209, how do I know what to buy? I don't perform. I'm not in the remote ID space. I'm not in the technology space. I am a fertilizer manufacturer, or I am a electric supplier, right? I don't know which remote ID to buy. So do I have any basis for a standard here on what is the minimum standard? So on the one hand, Brandon, I get it, and I never really thought about it this way before until you said it, how hard it is to change regulation, right? And so if you implement a piece of technology as part of regulation, and that technology is going to maturate probably overnight, that regulation could probably be a moot point and completely useless if it's going to stay as a regulation for X amount of time. So maybe this might be a bad idea, but I'm just thinking about it. Maybe there's one of two things. There is a defined standard in that piece of regulation that is baseline performance. It has to perform at a minimum of X. It has to have a latency maximum of Y, and it has to have an accuracy within 10% of actual drone location, right? Whatever that is. Maybe that's the compromise there. But if there's no standard that all of these folks are held to as far as which technologies they can buy, more often than not, they're going to be throwing good money after bad on bad investments because they didn't understand what they were buying.
And Angie, I'm sorry, real quick. I just want to piggyback off that real fast because I went through the I'll say pleasure of going through the Part 89 rulemaking process, and when the decision was made to cut out network remote ID, this is what we get in the long run, is now that there's these stovepipe sensors, which is, I guess, fine for industry, those who produce those receivers, to not have that network capability where you don't necessarily need to purchase a remote ID sensor because you just tap into the network, which makes sense from how we've traditionally handled aviation data. There is a network of aviation information, and that's where you can go to FlightAware and some of these others with ADS-B broadcasts, and you can log in and see what's there. Now, to Nate's point, there is a latency issue with some of that programming. There are other things that happen. You know, wealthy folks that have private airliners can pay to say, hey, please don't post my data on FlightAware. So there's that. But it is a networked system. And so, in what we are seeing, though, also is some of these counter-UAS companies creating their own network of detection systems. And they are closed off. But if that propagates out and the Part 89 changes eventually to a network system, to Nate's point, we're spending money we don't need to spend. So again, and then what happens with the regulation is if the network system becomes a viable option, now the regulatory requirements out of date, and we'd have to change the regulation, which could take years.
I want to first start with regulations can take a while to change, but they don't have to. And so I think that is something that we've all just accepted as part of being in the feds. So Nate, you can push back on this as well. But they don't have to, and when situations change, that is when the federal government should be able to make changes without taking 10 years. 10 years is a very long time from when a rule is supposed to be out and when it's supposed to be published. We've seen rules come out much faster, and we've seen changes come out much faster. So I personally think we should hold us all as our country and the government to a higher standard and say, no, we can change regulations when we need to. I agree with Scott on the part where it's really, to me, just about air domain awareness. And this is just baseline air domain awareness. So whether we're using broadcast or network remote ID, we need to have some sort of standard where facilities know which RID compliant drone operators are in the air. They're following the rules. They should be able to know what's in the air. And they should have that information just as part of their security procedures. So I think we kind of all align, like, yeah, critical infrastructure should know what RID drone compliant operators are flying around them, but just a matter of how to effectuate that and how to do it the best way. But I think for where we are now, and if we're trying to give critical infrastructure owners and operators some guidance, I think this is a good place to start. So I'll kick it back over to you, Brandon.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Angie. So for the sake of time, we're going to do a part 2 on this. We did have one person that was supposed to join us, and they are not. Jen Daskell with Venable, incredibly experienced in this realm. So we'll follow up this webinar with a part 2 at some point. So I am going to cut one of the topics out. So we'll end on going back to the operator impact, which is the UAFR access or allowed operations, which is section 74.250. So one area in law that is critically important to understand is the nuance in the usage of specific language. Words matter, as they say. This is evident with respect with how section 2209 and the UAFR requirement was written in Congress with respect to the term restrict versus prohibit. Restriction implies some mechanism to still access, while prohibit straight up means no, you're not going in there. So with this in mind, Nate, from the operator perspective, given your years of experience, can you kind of talk through what that means for the operator side of the UAS industry in 229? Is it justified? Is the language they provide for access maybe too much or too restrictive? And then as far as balance of authority versus ability to access.
Yeah, so this is a industry-wide topic with some very, very hot opinions on both sides of this, right? So you have the operators and the asset owners that want to protect their assets at all costs. I get it, and they should be able to. At the same time, you have the operators on the complete other end of the industry saying, well, this is going to be restricting me from doing my job or giving me the privilege to fly. And I want to make sure I emphasize that. It's a privilege to fly a UAS. It's a privilege to partake in aviation. It's not a right. And so, I think that's really important to differentiate. Nonetheless, there is a subset of industry that makes money and continues to grow by operating UAS. So when I look at this, I kind of look at it from a couple different perspectives here. From the operator side, there's an argument that it's way too restrictive. I'm not going to be able to do my job. I can't fly anywhere in the country. And that's absolutely not the case, right? There is just now a process to access certain areas of airspace, just like there would be to access a military operating area. To me, from an operator, there's no difference there. And also as an operator, under no circumstance can I enter a presidential TFR, right? That's restricted. A special UAFR, I read that acronym, I really got to practice that. Special UAFR, right? I cannot enter that either. There's no change there for me as an operator either. It's just a synonymous extension of already existing aviation policy and law, right? That's generally how it works. From the asset owner side, there is sentiment that there are a lot of requirements and prerequisites as written to even apply for a UAFR or special UAFR. And there's two sides to that coin too, right? The FAA is not going to grant UAFRs for every single transmission structure in the country. There's over 7 million of them, right? But they are going to grant them to more sensitive facilities that have a larger economic or safety impact if incurred upon by a bad actor UAS. So that's a very long-winded word salad way of saying, I don't think that this is too restrictive for operators. This is no different than a TFR or a MOA. And from the asset owner side, I think that maybe some of the requirements should be rewritten or modified, but I don't necessarily think the requirements to submit for a UAFR or SUAFR are too restrictive either, or too extensive.
Scott, Angie?
I think there may be some work to be done when it comes to who should be allowed in allowed operations. For example, I'm a Part 107 pilot. I don't have the same leather jacket that Nate has, so I'm not a real pilot, right? I'm between a hobbyist and an aspiring commercial pilot. I don't know that I should be allowed to fly over a chemical plant who happens to be a standard UL. However, I think that law enforcement agency should definitely be able to fly over it. I think maybe there is some allowance, depending on how Part 108 fleshes out, that if you're doing long tracks along a certain corridor, you probably have passed a certain amount of burdens of proof. And so maybe you should be allowed some type of grace when it goes over those facilities. So I think the one big rub that most people have is the idea of a Part 108 pilot, because that is so big. It's me. And I'm not the kind of person who should be flying over a chemical plant at this juncture in my aviation career. So I think that's the first thing that the FAA should probably scale back what they mean by allowed operations, at least the types, and really keep it to those that probably have a higher burden of proof and accountability and training, as opposed to someone like me who just passed the test and have a drone.
I'll just add from to operationalize this for a critical infrastructure facility that doesn't currently have a drone program, I could see the coordination part of this. I want to use the word overwhelming. It would be overwhelming, especially if they have a lot of requests to fly over their facilities. I realize this is just a proposed rule, and this is kind of our first iteration in our country at a federal level of a 2209. But I would hope that as this program matures, that there would be some sort of mechanism that the FAA is able to implement to take some of that burden off of critical infrastructure, so that they're just plugging into a system that's already working well. And they're not the ones that are having to manage that, because that In certain areas, I could imagine that becoming a part-time, if not a full-time job for someone, just managing all of the flights that are being requested over their space.
So I want to add into this, speaking from the former FAA side of me, my office coordinated all of the federal 99, not all of the, I would say the vast majority of UAS specific 99.7s for the federal government, interagency, so DHS, DOJ, etc. The issue really comes down to, from my perspective, well, so there's two, is knowing when somebody is granted access that the operator, that the thing that's being protected by an organization who is ultimately responsible for that facility knows who is transiting that airspace. That's incredibly important. Because what we're going to see, and I know folks may not agree with me, but I, having been involved with this for almost 10 years now, at some point, private security, Allied Universal, Securitas, even critical infrastructure operators, PG&E, SoCal Edison, Duke, you name it, will get counter-UAS authority. It's just a matter of evolution in what needs to be protected and lack of resources from law enforcement side. They are not a 24/7 security element. They just will never have the personnel or the funding to provide that level of security from sensitive critical assets that are commercially owned and operated. So in case in point, Senator Cotton recently proposed a bill, S-4380, to allow critical infrastructure operators to have counter-UAS authorities. Same that the Coast Guard has, detection and mitigation, and then get federal government liability protection on that. So if, and this is one of the things I could be wrong, and I did not see in there, is that someone who is allowed, whether you're a 135 operator, 137, a future Part 108 operator, etc., that operator of that particular facility needs to know who that is. Because when counter-UAS authorities do come through and there is a violation, the time to react it's seconds. This is very, very quick. And they will react to protect the facilities, especially when you're talking about critical infrastructure grid and the nodes, especially large substations, where you can have domino effects and power surges in certain areas where the whole grid can topple itself because it just can't handle that load and be transferred to other power stations fast enough. So again, trying to view the writing on the wall, there needs to be requirements for that critical infrastructure operator, not just the FAA, to know who is transiting that airspace, no matter who it is. The other thing I wanted to point out, and something that Scott said that clued me in on it, is chemical facilities, oil refineries, highly flammable. You know, you have to wear fire protective gear just to go enter them. UAS are not flammably resistant, lithium-ion batteries. Who knows what they're carrying? And so it doesn't have to be a security concern. It can be a safety risk where if a drone crashes in that facility, it could ignite or spark, secondary effects, tertiary, and then create a bigger problem, chemical spills and fumes, toxic gas, all that stuff. So there is a safety aspect to this as well for some of these facilities that needs to be considered when allowing access to some of these things, in particular 137 operators or 135 operators carrying certain payloads. So let's say you're Wing, Amazon, UPS, etc. If you're carrying some type of flammable payload, you're not allowed to fly over that facility. It's dangerous. So I did not see that in the rule. I think it's something that needs to be considered as far as more than what regulatory pathway the operator is flying under, but also what they're potentially carrying. And then any feedback from the group here, and then we'll wrap this up.
Just real quick, I'll make it quick. I think Angie spoke about it. It's the notification requirements, and Brandon, you were alluding to the same. I think the rule should be more considerate to the owner-operator's current operating model. These mostly don't operate in a static way. There are times where they clearly have issues. Like you said, there are some facilities who have OSHA requirements and static discharge is a problem. And so all of that hopefully will manifest into a special UFR for those facilities and not the standard UFR. But for those who can't make the case and they have those episodic moments where they are a special case, there has to be a way in which that notification from the FAA to the facility that says Scott's going to fly over your facility can be responded to with not today, right? Or not this week for whatever reason. And so I think the FAA should really make that allowance for that two-way communication when it comes to all UAFR over.
All right, well, thank you so much. And then I just want to give everybody an opportunity to say last words before we cut. So we'll go in reverse order this time. So Nate, start with you.
Yeah, I think like all of us, it's exciting to see the NPRM after 10 years. I'm not going to date myself, but I was 26 when the rule was first discussed. So that's pretty exciting. I think that overall, I think 2209 is a very good next logical step in CUAS ability for industry and quite frankly need. And I look forward to helping those with comment submission and also reviewing the comments that come through. And then most importantly, I'm excited to see the FAA's response on the final rule.
All right, Angie?
Same with Nate. We saw 2209 a lot when we were at DOJ, so we're really excited to see it come through. I do just want to give props, which you usually won't hear too many DOJ partners say this, to the FAA. They put a lot of effort into this rule. Obviously, we can bring out a lot of things where it can improve, but they did a really good, thorough job of putting this together for a first pass, and they're very open to comments. So I just want to give Brandon, some of your former colleagues, a nod for the work they did. It was an extremely busy season for them. And then just want to say the importance of organizations providing input. The FAA clearly needs a lot of input from industry, and so it's really important that industry is doing that and putting in the work to provide really thoughtful comments and working with people like Nate, Scott, myself, Brandon to think through those comments and what they're submitting to help refine the rule. And I do think this rule will be updated in the next 5 to 10 years. I think this is just the first iteration of this rule that we're seeing in this country, and that it will be improved upon. Hopefully won't take 10 years, but I do think this is just a first iteration of what we're going to see coming out of the FAA with critical infrastructure protections. Back to you, Brandon.
Scott?
Yeah, so Nate and Angie took the two things that I wanted to harp on, so I appreciate that. So the quick pivot from those very important points would be that I think this is the first stage for critical infrastructure. It's incredibly important that we get it right, but it's also incredibly important that we get it. And so whatever we get on the far side, so long as we are starting to process UAFRs and making it known that there's airspace restrictions over these critical sites, but more importantly, having the owners and operators start to manage the airspace in whatever way that they're allowed to in this process, sets the conditions for the mitigation. Brandon, you talked about like the Senator Cotton bill. So it's vitally important that this get out the way it is, but also recognizes this is a step one, along the way to step one, into a process where we can finally find ourselves with like a national level, scalable process in which we can understand and manage UAS risk across all of our communities.
And then I'll just add with one last thing, based on my experience in the FAA and coming from a security background, not a safety background, and being in the FAA, one of the things that I really learned to appreciate is the balance between airspace access in general and security needs to restrict access. It is very, I don't want to say a sensitive topic, I'll say a complicated topic that is, there are people in rooms with incredible expertise and knowledge discussing this daily. and trying to work out nuances to make sure that we balance the freedoms and liberties that we have as being Americans and living inside the United States and having the most accessible airspace on the face of the planet, at least governed airspace, and being able to ensure that our national security is protected and our day-to-day lives are again, protected from those who wish to disrupt it. And so 2209, while it did take 10 years, it took 10 years for a reason. It took 8 years, I'll say, to really grind out the sausage making, if you will. And then the last 2 years, or maybe year and a half, was largely because of the New Jersey, New York drone, what we like to call drone gate, that really, we learned a lot. And it's one of those things that it's good that it happened. No one got hurt. We learned a lot. Yes, it caused a lot of fear, but it was exceptional. And I also want to give a shout out to our National Security Council friends that were involved in this, that we all know. I don't want to say names because I'm not sure if they would be happy with that, but the incredible inputs, and then the partnership between the FAA and DHS. Scott, when he was a former UAS security chief at CISA, had a lot of input into this, and so the work that went into this was incredible. They're not going to get it right, as we see in the NPRM perfectly at the first shot of it, and that's why there's public notice and comment. So please comment on the rule. Please read it. It is long, but it is incredibly important because it will be here for most likely the rest of your life. So, and your children's and your grandchildren's. But by then, who knows, we'll maybe be all robots by then with the AI takeover. So, again, thank you so much for your time. Please be on the lookout for part 2 when we get with Jen Daskell and go from there. So, again, thank you, SIA, so much for hosting this. Greatly appreciate it. And I hope everybody flies safe. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.